Welcome to another episode of the Millennials and Community podcast. On this week's episode, we explore staying accountable to your friends, how easily a rift can be created, why it's not the intention, but instead the perception, and how you can grow as a person by just saying one simple word. Thank you for being part of our community.
And hello, everybody. It's been a little while. I don't know if other podcasts you listen to have this, but a lot of podcasts that I follow take a little bit of a summer break, but theirs are usually planned. This one was not planned, and so we're back. And so we appreciate you taking a great, well-earned summer break with us, and hopefully you're less sick of our voices than you were before and ready for some more Mac.
Yeah, and as you can see, we're not in Matt's basement. We're actually we're doing something kind of special. We've decided to rent out a hotel room. Don't worry, we have separate beds for those that are wondering, although there might be some just friends spooning.
Could push them together.
We could. Ooh, pillow fight?
If you must.
Okay. And so we rented out a hotel room. We're going to knock out a whole bunch of episodes this week. We're really excited. It's also the first time Matt and I have seen each other since kind of like Stampede for any longer than like a few minutes. So we're super excited to get into some episodes. Hopefully everything is going to flow real nice. And, him and I won't end up hating each other by the end of the weekend.
And if we're a little bit rusty and trip over our words a little bit more than normal, you can just chalk it up to it being a little bit of a break since we've recorded last. So go easy on us. And as usual, whatever you love or don't love, let us know in our Discord. All right, so let's jump into it. As we mentioned, the last time that we really spent a lot of time together was during the Calgary Stampede. And so we're going to spend this episode talking about something small and relatively incidental that happened over Stampede, but that begs a bigger question of how do we actually look after one another as friends. But as always, we need to start with that icebreaker, hopefully get us into more of a flow and get all of our tongue ties out. So as our icebreaker question for this week's episode, we're going to start by telling each other about a time when you accidentally embarrassed a friend.
So I had to think kind of hard about this one. I'm sure there's many a time where you embarrass someone and you don't really even realize that you've done so. But the one that kind of comes to mind for me was that I was in high school, and it was, not to date myself, but around the time that phones just started becoming more capable, right? They started having cameras in them, and, you started to get the inklings of a couple apps and stuff like that. So I remember I had this one friend, and he decided to take a video of another friend that I was quite close to. Well, the friend that had the video taken of him was not happy with this. He did not want this video of him. Now, remember, this is the very beginnings of like being in a world where you can have a video taken of you at any point in time. So I proceeded to kind of like, oh, let me see that video, and then like covertly delete it. And then just spent the next 45 minutes pretending and making my friend, the one who took the video, think that he never took a video. And he's like, what are you talking about? I looked on the phone. There was nothing there. So by the end of it, I don't know whether he believed me or not, but he felt like he was a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. And I still kind of feel bad about it to this day, because we fought about it for a little bit.
Yeah, it sits with you.
It does.
It sits with you. And more so than it would if it was a complete stranger. But these people that are close to us, it just has this way of staying power.
It sure does. Yeah. What about you?
For me, it was a good friend of mine, and I know he listens to the podcast, but I also know he doesn't listen to podcasts very frequently. So we're going to see how long it takes until he hears this episode and calls me and says, hey, what the hell? But one of my closest friends, and we've been friends since junior high, and so obviously he's had to put up with my shit for a long time, and he's still around. So this is his fault, I tell him, but he doesn't like that very much. Anyway, the two of us used to work together, and we used to work together very, very closely. And the first time when we had the opportunity to attend a professional conference together. And just for a little bit of context, all of you know me pretty well at this point, know I'm quite outgoing and enjoy going out and enjoying a beverage here and there. Well, turns out at the conference we had gone to, that this is very much the culture of the conference. There's lots of drinking if you choose, lots of opportunity to network and have a good time in the presence of alcohol. Well, this friend of mine is less inclined to drink, which absolutely no disrespect there. But there was one night where at this conference we were sharing a hotel room where we had gone out, we had a great time. Both of us had a great time, and I will be very, very clear in saying that I had a blast with him in spite of the fact that he hadn't drank as much as I did. When we got back to our hotel room at the end of the night, I felt it necessary to pick up the phone and call a drunk phone call to another mutual friend of ours. Now, I thought I was being real sneaky because I went into the bathroom of our hotel room and I sat in the bathtub with the door closed, not recognizing just in fact how paper thin the walls were in this hotel room. And I had this conversation all about how just absolutely lame it was that this friend, didn't go harder or as hard as I did at this night out partying. And hung up the phone with this mutual friend, opened the bathroom door to a very disappointed look on this friend's face. We've obviously talked about it since. This is almost 10 years ago. So, things are fine. But I just remember, same thing as you, that feeling of like, you see that look of betrayal and you realize that you messed up and that there's some things that you need to do to make up for it. And I just felt so bad in that moment that conversation that I thought was private was completely not. And that this person that I hold very dear to my heart heard me talk about in that moment how drunk me thought he should have been more drunk.
So, you may be listening to this and going, hey, well, that's somewhat of a fun story, but why are these guys kind of airing the dirty laundry of this past, ingression on their friends' trust, right? Why would they share that with us? And it's because today's episode is all about a kind of accountability between friends. Now, this was brought on for a very specific reason. Now, I'm going to preface this. This is the middle of Stampede. Okay, so several weeks back.
Not now, but a few weeks ago, or else we wouldn't be able to afford this hotel room.
That's right. Stampede, if you've never been to Stampede, drains lots of parts of you, including your wallet. Okay, so we're, it's the middle of Stampede. We've got some friends in town. There's lots of people around. It's night after night of partying. We're probably malnourished, not eating proper nutrition. We're over drinking, overstimulating. And I don't remember the exact point in time or exactly what led up to it, but I remember looking in your pantry. And to preface this, to give you an idea of the kind of person I am, I do not have any semblance of willpower whatsoever. I cannot have any sort of snack, treat, dessert, candy in my house for any sort of prolonged period of time, because the moment it is in the house, it will be eaten. It will be consumed. In fact, as kids, my parents would take us out for what we called junk food runs, where we would, on a Friday night before we gathered as a family for a movie, we would go to the convenience store. Each of us would buy some junk food. We would eat that entire packet as a family before the night ended. Okay. So I'm looking in Matt's pantry and I'm looking around at all of these things. And I believe the comment was, how do you have this amount of junk food in your house? If you ever complain to me about struggling to lose weight, I will know exactly what to blame, or something along those lines. Now, remember, middle of Stampede, we've spent practically the whole week together. I by no means meant this in any sort of rude or accusatory way. But it hits you, I think, a little bit harder than I ever anticipated it to.
Yeah, and in that moment, I was definitely a little upset about it. I we've talked a lot on this show, if you've been listening with us for a long time, that both of us grew up to some degree struggling with our weights at various times, kind of in a typical roller coaster pattern throughout our lives. And so this idea that there was a comment made that I've got far too many snacks in my pantry in order to like live a healthy life, and not what you said, but that was how I heard it in that moment, really hit me kind of hard. And it made me disappointed and sad, mostly because as much as we're both passionate about our fitness and our nutrition journey, we approach it in very different ways.
Drastically.
Very, very different ways, right? Like we talk about kind of moderation versus intermittent fasting, like pushing huge personal bests in the gym and heavy weights versus a consistent kind of, daily routine. And just like very, very different. And so I took it not only as a comment on like my ability to maintain my own health and wellness, but also took it as a comment on, your way was better than mine, and that all of those things maybe not fairly, but that was what I heard in that moment.
Yeah. And so this is kind of what this episode is about, is that even as like the closest of friends, because arguably to be friends that have a podcast together, that spend a lot of non-working, non-podcast time together. There's a very large sense of closeness between us, but it doesn't mean that you can't screw up and you can't say the wrong thing, or you can't take something the way the other person said it in a different context than how they meant it. It can totally happen. That's not something that's exclusive between strangers, right? So you said nothing to me when this happened.
Yeah, and in my head, I was thinking, yeah, that hurt, that sucks, but now's not the time. We've got friends from out of town. We've got 4 or 5 more nights of Stampede left to go. My sense is I'm going to address this with them after Stampede when the dust is settled and we can actually have a conversation and debrief it instead of the heat of the moment.
Yeah, and which is something that I do very much appreciate. But at the same time, and I said this to you after this came to light, hey, if you just said, hey, what do you mean by that? I would have clarified what I meant. Because what I meant was, how do you have this all in your house and not just consume it constantly? Because like I said, I have it in my house. It's gone. I have no willpower with that. To the point that I will make my girlfriend hide her snacks. I don't care what you bring into this house, but you hide them, right?
Well, and the irony of that is like on a I don't know, a semi-annual basis, my girlfriend and I will go and we'll like throw out outdated candy. Like we actually are like, well, I guess we can't eat this anymore. And so obviously that stuff stays in there for an extended period of time. But again, that's that perspective thing. Yeah. So I decided that I wasn't going to make this comment to Carlo, but of course I'm going to talk about it to my girlfriend. And she felt that it was not appropriate that we wait until the end of Stampede that this gets brought up.
So I'm gonna try my best to play out this conversation to you, and I haven't even explained it to Matt how it was brought to my attention. So I'm sitting there on the couch. We are having a couple drinks before we head out.
Some of us are playing beer pong. There's a lot going on.
And I'm sitting there, and I think I'm like scrolling through music, or I'm on my phone, just kind of a little bit of downtime between beer pong games. And Kim sits next to me, and she goes, like, no preface into this. She just straight up goes and brings it up. And I don't remember the exact words, but she brings it up and she says, hey, I hear you said this. Maybe next time before you say something like that, you should be a little bit more considerate about how that person feels about, their weight and those kind of challenges they have in their life. And my response to her, and this is going to kind of open up a bag of worms of like how men handle this kind of stuff versus how maybe women handle it. My immediate response was like, fair point. And I kind of retreated back into my own brain to process what was brought forward to me. But on the exterior side, she sees me just kind of going back to what I was doing as if this was like no big deal. Right? But in the meantime, I'm in my head going like, shit, did I actually like upset him? He didn't say anything. Why didn't he say anything? Now I feel like a jerk, right? And of course, she calls me out and she goes, "What? You're not going to say anything about this? You're not even going to apologize?" So across the room, I go, "Hey, Matt, I'm sorry." When I said this, I'm sure it maybe came across as disingenuous how I maybe made this apology because it was so like instantaneous. But like to me, I'm still in my brain, like, how do I properly apologize to Matt so that he knows this is a genuine apology? I never meant it to be bad, but I was now put on the spot to basically apologize before I was ready to do it properly. So I hit you with this apology. You said, "Hey, thanks." And then I think Kim was mostly satisfied with that, maybe. But then afterwards, I kind of pulled you aside after and said, "Hey, legitimately, this is where that comment came from. I meant no disrespect. I meant no insult to you. It was more of a comment on myself than anything." But it was a really kind of interesting thing because you and I having these very close personalities, we don't have really many moments in our friendship that I would say we, genuinely hurt each other's feelings, right? There may be the one-off comment or the one little thing that makes you kind of introspective and be like, okay, but I know he didn't mean anything by that, so whatever. But this was one of those ones that was big enough to really necessitate an apology and obviously now a podcast episode, because that's how we heal as friends, right? So like now that I've kind of shared that story, is there anything else that you want to bring to light that I haven't said so far that we need to consider during this?
No, I think that's, as far as I remember it, a good recount of the story. I think that one of the reasons why we took, after we had the chance to debrief it and after, we went through all of the alcohol withdrawal symptoms after Stampede.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
It was an opportunity for us to, first of all, like deal with it, the two of us, which I'm really, really grateful that we did. I am very also grateful to Kim for like wanting to make sure that it is addressed. So I'm very appreciative of that. But I think that more why we wanted to make this an episode, oftentimes we have a really, really well-formed sense of accountability when it comes to people that are just kind of acquaintances, or we have a really good sense of fairness, sense of equality, sense of responsibility with people that we have more transactional relationships with. It might be our colleagues, it might be somebody that we interact with in a more service level of capacity. But when it comes to people that are really, really close to us, I think that we have a harder time defining accountability for a couple of reasons. One, there's a level of comfort, right? We have this level of comfort that is built on a foundation of years of getting to know each other and loving each other and all of those things. And so we are more predisposed to forgive people for things in spite of the fact that something that they said might have hurt us. A second piece of it is I think that we also want to give people the benefit of the doubt. We know these people, and so therefore we don't want to bring anything up because, as you pointed out, they don't mean anything by it. It's not meant to offend, but that doesn't mean that things can't still hurt us, and these need to be separated as things. And I think that kind of the last piece of it that I think is worth addressing too is that it's important because people who we hold close to us, we should be able to hold to a certain standard, I think. And I think that's really important because when we let our friends off the hook, it creates a really uncomfortable place where we go home and we bitch about things or we complain about things, and that's not a constructive way to go. And if these people are as close to us as we think they are, then we should have the ability to have these tough conversations with them. And if those conversations don't go well, maybe those people aren't meant to be as close to you as you think they are. And so, oftentimes I think that accountability is something that we lack in our friendships and our close relationships because we're afraid of going into these deep places with them. But I think that's why it's even more important that we get to talk about why it's important that we practice this.
Yeah. I I really love the idea of like holding our close friends to a higher standard, because that is true. Like we live in a world where there are so many things trying to draw our attention, that are trying to draw our feelings, right? Like all marketing in general is about drawing a feeling out of you, right? So if that feeling is being drawn out of you on a day-to-day basis to try and sell you something, just imagine how impactful it can be to draw a feeling out of you to create a genuine interaction between you and a friend, right? So one of the big things that this was really important to me to kind of talk about and to dive a little bit deeper is that my family, like, you know, I've mentioned many times on this show, we're Italian. We're hot-headed. And like I watched my mom as a kid, I watched my mom lose so many relationships, not by any fault of her own, usually. So mom, if you're listening to this, like, sorry, I'm going to hold you accountable, which is the theme of the episode. But usually she didn't lose a relationship because of her. But it was because someone in this scenario was too proud to say, I'm sorry. And as men, this is something that we run into a lot very often as well, is that we're afraid to take the blame. And it's not that we know we didn't do anything wrong. It's that it seems lesser than to say I'm sorry or to take accountability for what you have done. But you are far too important to me for me not to say 2 words, I'm sorry, when I genuinely screwed up.
Yeah.
Right? You know, the thought of losing you as a friend just because I couldn't, you know, well, I didn't mean it that way and you shouldn't have taken it that way and now you're being silly. Who cares whether it was or was not a big deal? 2 words, I'm sorry, right? Allows us to continue the value that we have in our friendship. So, you know, as we kind of look, why is this episode something that's important? Why is it something that we felt it was necessary to talk about? Because everything in this world these days seems to be rooting against us. So when you have a good friend, you have a good family member, a good relationship in your life, if it legitimately just takes, you know, just a little bit of a whip to say, hey, I screwed up and I'm sorry because I screwed up. And that allows you to maintain the good quality relationships you have in your life. Get over yourself and just say it. Because you better believe that as I was apologizing in front of everybody, like when I say everybody, there's like 5 people in the room and half of them had no idea what we were talking about. It does take a little bit of like, you know, I'm going to check myself and say I'm sorry in front of everybody, and, you know, and then have a couple people come to you after and be like, what were you talking about? And then having to explain the story again, right? Because we were all in a group of good friends, right? It does take a little bit of humility to do that. I would much rather metaphorically bring myself down a couple pegs and say sorry to you than I would for you to fester in that for weeks on end and then wonder why you're not answering my calls, or why it feels like our relationship and our conversations aren't as genuine as they could be. So I think it's really, really important to take a step back sometimes and like realize that like you're not all high and mighty. And I say that like I am not all high and mighty, right? Say sorry. Take accountability for the mistakes that you make. It's important, right? Because there's not many people in this world that are as genuine that they will do that. So when you find somebody who's willing to say, I'm sorry, is willing to come to you with hey, this hurt my feelings, whether it comes through, you know, a third party or not, because I know you would have talked to me about it eventually, right? It's really important that you can demonstrate some humility and just like take it on the chin, because it will maintain that relationship. And the last thing I would ever want is to have our relationship hurt because of something so silly. Right.
And I think that you bring up, you know, humility is a really important topic to bring up here, I think. But the other one I want to talk about kind of interchangeably between the two is empathy. I think accountability is pretty easy to understand in this context. It's holding ourselves responsible for our own actions, right? It's the idea that I'm going to say, you know what, that was me, I did that. regardless of how I intended it to go, this was the result of the thing. And I think too often when we're communicating with other people, particularly those close to us, we spend so much time rooted in what we meant. And it should be someone else's responsibility to interpret how we meant it. And I think that comes back to both empathy and humility, from the sense that if we're truly being empathetic, I'm a big believer that when I'm communicating with somebody, that it is my job it is not my job to make sure that I'm sending the right message. It is my job to make sure that message is received, right? Like, think about it like a male person. My job is not to take the letter, the card, the envelope. My job is to make sure that envelope safely is delivered to that mailbox at the other end, right? So if I'm acting in a way that is taken badly, it's my job to understand why. It's my job to understand and take responsibility for the fact that I caused a ripple or a wave or whatever consequence on the other end. And then humility is kind of the second half, to like do something about that, to swallow my pride. And, like you said, like you did, instead of saying, listen, like, this isn't what I meant, and not getting like rooted in that, but instead saying, this was what happened and I'm sorry, right? Like, there's a very big difference between this is what I did, this is what I meant, versus this is what happened. And I feel like there's such a gap so often between what I meant and what actually happened that people refuse to acknowledge. And that leads to your point, so many hurt feelings, broken relationships of all kinds. And you're right, it's not worth it. It's not worth it in the world that we're living in. There's too many opportunities to be offended, to be hurt by things that happen, that all of us need to be in a position to recognize those relationships that we hold most dear, and to be willing to take a step back, as you so beautifully said, and say, you know what? I messed up. That's on me. This was the outcome. Whatever I meant it to be, this was the outcome, and I'm going to treat the outcome.
And this was something that provided a lot of great introspection for myself as well. And I actually haven't discussed this with you, but there was two major things that kind of came to light for me with this. Is one, there was a part of me that went like, I can't believe he's gotten upset about this, because arguably I'm the fatter of the two. Okay. So for those of you that don't know, it's been 5 years, but 5 years ago, I was over 300 pounds. I was a very large person. No offense to anybody over 300 pounds that's listening to this, but I, for my own body shape and height, was way overweight. And I lost a whole bunch of that weight, and I'm eternally grateful for that. But part of me was like, are you kidding me? The fat guy is making a comment about snacks, and the guy who has arguably been significantly skinnier all his life is upset about it? And I put it past me, right? Because, like, again, like you said, it doesn't matter how I meant it. It's how you took it. But like inside, I'm like, because I still view myself as the fat kid, right? I've been fat. I've been overweight all my life. And please understand, this is not me fat shaming or body shaming anybody. This is from a very deep seated, like, I'm still the fat kid internally, right? So I had that introspection of like, okay, maybe other people don't view you as the fat kid anymore. And I'll give you the grain of salt is that I don't think you ever viewed me as the fat kid, right? But in my own mind, I was the fat kid, and I'm still the overweight kid, right? Doesn't matter how much muscle I have or what I weigh, I will always view myself as that, right? So I had to kind of have that introspection there. The other part of it was like, maybe you need to change your thinking about how you approach some of these things. Because I find myself very often having conversations with people. Like, my little sister is a great example. For those of you that haven't seen the episode that she's in, she's just the most beautiful, wonderful young sister I could ever ask for. She's successful, and she's kind, and she's just all these things. Well, she is going through her own version of a fitness journey right now. And she tells me some of these struggles that she's having. And there's part of me going, I've been through that. I know exactly what you're going through. And then I'll explain that to her. And she goes, no, it feels different. Right. And it's this kind of introspective moment of like, we all handle our self-perceived inadequacies differently. Right. And doesn't matter where you're coming from. I think it's so immensely powerful to kind of take a step back and be like, hey, this is how I view it, but that is not the way that others will view it. So we've told the story. We've gone through how each of us have kind of felt on it. I guess the next major milestone would be here is like, how is there a way that I could have handled the apology differently to you that would have been more satisfactory? Or were you pretty like, hey, I feel like Carlo means this and I'm good with it?
Yeah, I mean, in that moment, the way you played it back is definitely true. I mean, it kind of, in that moment, came across as a fairly surface level apology that you just want to kind of move on to the next thing. And I just kind of took the apology at face value. But then when you did come up to me afterwards and we had the chance to talk about it, that was what was meaningful to me. And I think that that's really what is really, really important is in the moment when you discover it, in all likelihood, there isn't an apology that's really going to be meaningful because you're still in the heat of the moment when you've freshly offended somebody. Even if, I say something to you, I see in your face immediately that it has hurt you, and I instantly say sorry. Mm-hmm. Right? This was removed about a day or two, but even so, instantly you see that, you say you're sorry. Well, that apology in and of itself probably isn't enough.
Sure.
Right? It is a reaction, right? And when apologies are a reaction, we miss the point. We miss the point of again, taking that opportunity to reflect on what we did, how it hurt the other person. And apologies are meant to be, I believe, apologies are meant to be an acknowledgement that we understand what caused harm to another person. And realistically, most often, that's probably really hard or impossible to do in that moment, in that instant. Sometimes maybe, but for the most part, that split-second apology isn't going to cut it. But I think the fact that you took the time and you pulled me aside after and said, hey, listen, can we touch base about this? I want to fully understand. I want to fully know why that bothered you, what it meant. And here's what I meant. I understand that that's not how you took it, but here's kind of where we went wrong. Let's close this gap. I think that's where the magic is, because I think that there's so often that in the moment that a moment happens and there's an offense that occurs, we feel by default so highly, right? We're just so much more sensitive to whatever those things are. We're not necessarily in that place to receive logic, right? Because our limbic brain is going, we're very emotionally stimulated. We don't have the chance for our prefrontal cortex to engage and say, okay, let's actually understand what happened here. So I think that for me is the biggest thing, is to know that when we have a situation where we've caused something with a person, yeah, it's important to have that apology up front, as superficial as it may be, but to do the work and to sit back and say, okay, here's what happened. Let me think about that. Let me replay that in my brain. Let me go through it, watch all the highlights of it in my brain. Let's understand what happened. Let's have a conversation about it. To me, that's what makes a genuine apology, and I appreciate you for that. And I think that for me, it was a really powerful moment of remembering that we both go about things in a very different way. And it's funny to hear you talk about how you perceive yourself as the fat kid. I have that perception too, right? I also have always been the fat kid. We have that different journey, very much different journey on it. But I too was that and have that sort of ingrained in me. And And I guess what probably hurt me the most was knowing that you have that in you too, that you would make a comment like that to someone who feels the same way as like also being the fat kid in the room. And that's probably what hurt me the most in that moment. And so it's interesting to hear you be like, but I'm fatter. How is he feeling that way? And then to kind of miss the two ships in the night kind of thing of that. And it's a really interesting thing to debrief and to recognize. And so, I mean, to come back to your question, I really appreciate the way that you handled it. Obviously, you know, bless Kim's heart, you were a little bit blindsided. And you know what?
It felt like it came out of nowhere.
But I'm so glad. I'm so thankful for her.
Of course.
Because she's there
Me
and
too.
she's defending me and she's wanting to stand up for me. And I'm so, so grateful to her for it. You really had no choice in that moment but to have a superficial apology. There was really no other thing you could have done. And so we had the opportunity to have a conversation after, and that what it is. But I think that again, accountability has to come back to empathy, and it has to come back to humility. And these are things that we both, all of us, that every one of you listening, need to recognize that apology is probably not just an I'm sorry, but there's a process there of understanding where the gap is between what I meant, how I was received, how I can close the gap, and then to like have the other party involved understand how that gap can be closed amongst the group of us. That's really important.
Yeah. And like, I want to give a lot of credit to Kim as well, because I remember as I was kind of leaving that day or the next morning, I don't recall, it all blurs together.
Might as well not have been a clock.
Yeah, I remember giving her a hug and saying, thank you for telling me that, you know, Matt was hurt by this, because the last thing that I want is this to create some sort of rift between us. So I want to give her a lot of credit too. At the same time, Kim, give a man a moment to process. So, okay. So I think what we've done is we've aired the inner monologue that is our friendship here for a bit. And for those of you that have listened for a long time, you know all about how Matt and I operate. For those of you that might be new, you're going, what is wrong with these two? But how do we broaden this scope? How do we say, hey, on a professional, on a community, on a generational level, why is this an important topic for us to actually be addressing?
Yeah. So I think, you know, everything that we do in the Millennials and Community podcast, we try to bring back, as you say, to millennials and community. For me, when we talk about millennials, when we talk about the generation, I think it's less about the fact that we're millennials and more so kind of time captured to where we are right now. And so we are, us personally as millennials, obviously there's a bigger age range, but I think that's probably common to a lot of millennials is there's some divergence happening in our relationships, right? Some people are quicker to have families. Some people are quicker to get married. And so I think that just by virtue of where the millennials sit in terms of their age, there is the biggest possible divergence in terms of the stage of life that each of us finds ourselves in. And so I think that's really, really important in a couple of reasons, because as we learn, as we grow, we naturally become more set in our ways, whatever biases we hold, opinions we have, and those things are going to be more firmly rooted. But when we look at these relationships that we've had, in the case of you and I, since we were probably 19 or 20, there is the space and the opportunity for a lot of our relationships, a lot of the friendships that we had in high school, university, childhood, to diverge, right? And you and I have both lost a lot of really close friendships, not lost per se, but we're not connected to people that we were at that age because of the way that our lives diverge based on the stage of life. And it was such a shame to think that we could preemptively speed that up by saying something dumb that we don't realize, right? So what I guess I think is really, really important to think about in our stage of life as millennials is the idea that there's enough going on in our lives, whether it's family, career development, what have you, that is going to pull us apart, that we don't need to be adding to this in and of ourselves, right? Like, we need to recognize that it is hard enough at our age to make a living, maintain a family, support our loved ones, look after our parents, help our children. Keeping friends is hard enough.
Yeah.
We need to make damn sure that if we're going to be able to keep friends, that like we need to have the opportunity to see, acknowledge, and process what we've done wrong and then make amends accordingly.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you. And I think what's interesting when you think about it almost on a generational or maybe even a work-related level, I feel like one of the big things that millennials bring to the table is that we are so much more connected to the feelings of the other, of not only our own generation, but of other generations, right? Like, we're that in between. And this is something that we're going to talk about on another episode really quickly here, but it's this idea that like we bridge the gap between the baby boomers and the Gen Zers, right? And because of that, I think it acutely forces us to be more aware of how others are feeling and being able to have that empathy of maybe I don't feel this way, but there's a possibility or there is this reality of another person feeling that way. So it makes us so much more aware of those kind of things. And I think that if you can truly have the ability to be like, hey, I fudged up and or I noticed how this other person messed up. How can I mitigate this situation so that everybody walks away feeling a little less hurt? Because you'll never solve every problem, emotionally speaking. And no matter how you want to look at it, no matter how you may have a manager or a boss out there that thinks that emotions have no place in the workforce, you're wrong. Human beings are human beings no matter what scenario they're put in. If you can kind of take a step back and be like, hey, I'm aware of how this works, not only for millennials, but for other generations, and you can bridge that gap for everybody, there's an immense amount of power in that. And I think it really puts us as millennials in a unique situation to be the next great leaders out there. And again, we're going to talk about this shortly. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that kind of unique position that we're in.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. So from a community standpoint then, how does this coalesce? Because, obviously when we hurt someone, it's usually a one-to-one thing, but we know though from the way that, in my family, we call this the jungle drums. And we talk about how my grandma has this way of spreading gossip throughout the family in the jungle drums, right? So like, we know that when there is some sort of a discourse between two people where one person has offended the other, and then there's the ripple effect, right? Yeah. And whether out loud or silently, it has the ability to trickle outwards and impact the whole group. So think about group or community as big or as little as you like, but we know that when there's conflict between two people, that it has the ability to impact the greater community that those people are a part of.
It can very quickly create a rift in ways you don't even realize.
So I guess, first of all, like, what are some things that you think are the kind of the easy signs or warning signs that some sort of relational rift is happening in communities that you're a part of? But then secondly, like, what sorts of mechanisms do you count on in a community to mirror back to you when you've made those mistakes, when you've messed up?
Sure. So like a quick and easy quotations for those listening to kind of perceive that a rift is starting is just purely the way people treat you, right? Like, especially in a leadership style position that many of us will find ourselves in at this point in our lives and our careers. So when somebody starts to treat you different, you need to take a moment and be like, why? Sometimes it's almost beneficial to take a step back and be like, what did I do to cause this? Because a lesser person will be like, well, what's wrong with this person? Why are they being a jerk to me? But a greater person will go, what could I have possibly done? And then having the courage to take a step back, bring that person aside and say, hey, I noticed there's something going on. Is there something that I have done that I'm not aware of? Right? So again, that takes humility. It takes a lot of courage for you to be like, maybe I messed up. Because nobody wants to admit that they're the problem. Right? We all want to believe that in the grand scheme of things, we are the better person and that we're always doing what's best for everybody. But you make mistakes. I make mistakes. Everybody does. So being able to just kind of take that step back and say, maybe there's something I'm not aware of. Can you enlighten me? And maybe there isn't. Maybe they're like, actually, no, I'm going through some stuff at home. Cool. How can I support you in that? Right? But maybe there is something that you did. Right? So there's kind of that part. The other side of it is that as a whole, no matter what generational divide you belong to, you should be really willing to accept an apology. Right? And that's also hard because you want to sit in your feelings sometimes. You want to be like, this person is, treated me poorly and I want to be mad at them about it.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's just part of the greater good and the good of your own self to be like, you know what? Let's water under the bridge this one. Right? Now, that being said, we can have many conversations about how you don't want to have toxic people in your life and you need to draw a line somewhere and all that kind of stuff. But in the example of you and I, if you were to draw a line with me and be like, that's it, our friendship is over, that would suck, knowing all the things that we've been through. But you had the wherewithal and the humility to say to yourself, Carlo's apologized, right? And I'm willing to take that and move on. But that also takes a lot to do. So like, in your community, when somebody wrongs you, be willing to move past it because it is of no one's benefit to hold on to this kind of stuff.
Yeah. I think that's really well said. I think those are really, really key parts. And I remember both of us had the opportunity to spend some time with someone who, I think he's 20 or 21, something like that, relatively recently. And he confided in us about some drama going on within his friend group. And both of us gave him the advice of, he will realize he's messed up. Your job is to be there for him when he comes back, because he will.
So hard.
But that really speaks to what you're saying is like, you need to be ready to accept the apology and you need to be ready to be there for that person when they come back around. And I think those things are both really important because egos are a hell of a thing and egos will really stand out. And you're right. If you let ego get in the way of being a part of the solution, then you're no better than the person that caused the harm to begin with. And, in this case, certainly, and in a lot of cases, the harm isn't something it's not trivial, but it's not something that needs to cause everlasting harm. And so it's important to recognize that and to be, as you say, brave enough, courageous enough to take that apology. I want to ask you something different though, because, this is something that I think about a lot. I am really blessed to be in like a really, really cool leadership position at work. Like I have just some really, really freaking cool people that work with me. But I'm like constantly aware of how cool the team dynamic is and not willing to mess it up. And I think a lot about what would happen if I was to cause someone else offense at work, from the standpoint of like, have I done enough to create an environment where if I piss someone off at work that's on my team, have I done enough to build a team culture where like they feel safe coming to me and calling me on it when I'm in a position of power over them, you know? And so I think that this is probably something that's a little more relatable for folks at work to think about. And so I guess there's maybe the two-sided parts of this is, you know, one, how do I create enough of an environment as a leader where I know that my team can come to me if I've messed up, if I've put my foot in my mouth and didn't know it, and hold me accountable? And two, how do I have the space to go to my leaders, to the people higher than me in whatever sort of organization hierarchy, and have them or make them aware of times that I've been hurt?
So those are two very, in my opinion, very intermingled concepts, because as a leader, to foster an environment where people are willing and capable of coming to you in that kind of event, you have to really work hard to create that open door policy, right? And I don't mean like literally your door is open, but like nothing can be too big of a deal. It almost needs to be like, hey, we all go through things where like customers or clients cause these issues and we deal with that as a team together. And, you know, you can kind of have that me versus the client mentality sometimes, right? But at no point should your environment ever foster management versus worker or me versus them, because that's not what it's about. That's going to create you so many problems. It is more about, you know, when you have a problem, I should be your first stop, whether that is a problem I can help you solve or I can help you walk through. Because good leadership, if we're focusing on kind of like a work-related idea here, good leadership is not solving the problem for your people. It is providing them with the tools to solve that problem. And if the tool is, I'm going to go and talk to my leadership and help them walk me through this delicate situation, that is immensely more powerful. So you have to like really foster this feeling of open door. And I actually saw something today. This is very aptly timed. It was a father took a note. He wrote a note and he put it in the drawer, the top drawer of his daughter's, you know, clothing drawer. And this note said, if at any point you are afraid to come tell me something, bring me this note and it will remind me that we are on the same team and I am supposed to be your support, not your enemy. And like that was so immensely powerful for me, because what a way to foster communication, right? Because sometimes we do need to be reminded, right? Like you said, like in the thick of it, if I had apologized right in that moment, it wouldn't have meant what it meant, right? But, you know, if I had come to you and said, hey, remember this note you wrote me 2-3 years ago that said, hey, if we ever have a fight, I know you never meant it. You'd be like, okay, let me check myself. What happened, right? So that was really, really powerful. And, you know, the other side is this idea of you're not always going to have people in your life that are willing to accept that apology, accept that reasoning. And I can give you many examples of this in my own personal career. But you need to have the courage to say the sorry and know that it doesn't matter what the response is, that you did what was right. Because you will sit with that so much more profoundly than you will of going, well, I know this person's never going to listen to me, so I'm not even going to bother. No, just flip and say it. Say, I'm sorry. And if they want to come back and be a jerk about it and just disregard that sorry and sit there in their hate, then that is the internal monologue that they want to foster for themselves. And that has nothing to do with you. Right?
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I think that certainly a lot of the time it's something that we need to do for us to know that we have completed the journey to process what we're going through. And I think that's really important, because as much as we think that some sort of squabble between us and another person only affect us, it never does. It always affects the people around us, and there's obviously community ramifications to that, whether it is a group of friends, a workplace, a family, whatever it is. There's always some community ramification to that. And so, I think that we could continue to talk at length, but this is a really good opportunity. If ever any of you have experiences that you'd like to share about times where there's been some sort of a riff or misunderstanding, or someone was offended by something that happened, or you were the one taking offense, come find us in our Discord. Mm-hmm. Connect with us, and obviously, like we continually say, we don't have the answers, but we would love to create a conversation with you in hopes of creating some sort of peace or resolution feeling with you. So I love this. I love this idea that we've kind of talked about our generation. We've talked about communities and the implications and ways that we can support. Let's move a little bit into our Make Actions Count section. Let's talk about what it means to actually take this and action this. So I guess as things that are opportunities for advice, what would you, apart from things you've already shared maybe, or maybe summarize and codify, like what are the actions that you think are important for people to take, whether they've been in a situation where they have inadvertently offended somebody close to them, or whether they are on the receiving end of something harmful and they're not really sure how to do it. What are kind of the action steps that you would advise them to take?
So if you have the feeling that you've insulted someone and you didn't mean to, take the preemptive idea of like, hey, I feel like maybe this didn't come across the way that I meant it to. There's a lot of power in saying, did you take offense to that? I didn't mean it. Did you take offense to that? And have that person, because sometimes they'll be like, no, I'm good. Cool. Awesome. I didn't mean anything by it. And then you will have that person says, no, actually, yeah, that was way ruder than I ever thought you would say. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it like that. Because there's an immense amount of power in that like preemptive action. Like if you've ever had somebody come to you and say, hey, I didn't mean to be so rude to you. You were rude? I didn't think you were rude. Yeah. Right? But like the fact that you thought about me that way, thank you. Right? I think that's really important. And then if you have been offended, don't be afraid to go to that person and say, hey, I don't think you meant it that way, but like, this is how I feel about it. And I guarantee you 9 times out of 10, they'll be like, oh, I'm sorry. I had no idea that that's how it was perceived, right? Give people the benefit of the doubt more than anything. Give them the benefit of the doubt that they didn't mean it that way. And you didn't, weren't supposed to take it that way and all that kind of stuff. Because human beings, we're kind. Like on the whole, we're kind. But you need to give each other the space to be that kind of kind, right?
I love that. I totally agree. I think that what I would add is, it's funny. So, when you hear something, you're listening to a podcast episode, you're like, oh my gosh, that's so like well describes the thing that I do. There's times where I'll be in social situations and people come up to me and they'll be like, are you okay? Like, yeah.
I do this with you very often.
Yeah.
I feel off. What's up?
Yeah, and a lot of the time, sometimes I am off, but a lot of the time we're like, yeah, I'm fine. What the hell? Like, what are you talking about? And I think about that a lot, and I get self-conscious. I'm like, what is it? Because usually I'm loud and gregarious and outgoing and whatever, but sometimes I'm just kind of like in the background, just hanging out. And then I heard a wonderful podcast episode lately. And when those of you who consume a lot of like podcast content hear the 3 people who were on this podcast episode, you're like, oh, that makes sense. It was Simon Sinek's podcast, and he had both Brene Brown and Adam Grant on his podcast. And it was an episode called Thinking About Thinking. And so if you have the opportunity, please like stop this episode immediately. Go check out Simon Sinek's podcast, A Bit of Optimism. It's the episode part 1 and 2, Thinking About Thinking with Brene Brown and Adam Grant. And they talked a lot about this idea of metacognition. which is a fancy way to say thinking about thinking. So I do this a lot. I find myself sitting back and being like, what am I thinking? How am I processing the things going on around me? What is it that I'm understanding about my social situation? How's this going? But the reason why I bring this up is I think that far too often we take for granted the way that we exist in our social settings. And I think that what's really important is for us to take the time and be actively in the moment introspective about what's going on around us, and taking the time to be like, oh, how do I fit in? What are the pieces to the puzzle? How do I exist in the social dynamic? What are the ways that I'm being perceived by the people around me? Am I acting in the best way to create a positive impact on this social space? And these are things that I think go through my head on a regular basis, but it really comes down to being socially aware. We've talked about the idea a lot about understanding how much social space we take up in a given setting. And to me, this is kind of an extension of that. If I know how much social space I'm taking up, then I also then know how I'm being perceived by other people. And to me, that's all a part of our social awareness. So anyway, that would be my suggestion, my action step for everybody. Take a listen to that episode. Again, it's a bit of optimism, the episode Thinking About Thinking. And it's just a really cool opportunity to take a step back and understand how we process the things going on, the thoughts in our head. And then more importantly, hopefully we can get a better and more accurate sense of how we're being perceived in the world around us. So that if we ever come across a situation where we have to put our foot in our mouth, we're better equipped to understand in that moment, process it, and then go to that person and make amends later on.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And I'll definitely check this episode out because I'm subscribed to that podcast. I don't listen to it nearly as much as I should. So I should get on that. All right. So as we kind of bring this episode to a close, Matt, I have felt this very cathartic, and like, it's a Friday night. We have an entire weekend planned where we're going to be spending time together and recording episodes. And I felt it was necessary to start this or do this episode in the high of like, we haven't seen each other in a while. Let's clear the air, even though like I feel like this has mostly been settled between us, but like, let's clear the air of it. Let's use this episode as a little bit of like a therapy session for each other. And I think it's come across really, really well. But as we kind of bring it to a close, is there anything else that you want to say? Do we have an icebreaker for the end of the episode? What are you feeling here?
I think it's, for me, I want to go right into gratitude. I think that, again, like, I think it's really, really common for friendships to happen where things happen between friends. We go and we bitch about it to another friend, and then we just move past it and things remain status quo with that friend. I think that's really, really common. And if I know anything, and I know that it was the beginning of this season of the podcast where I like shot back sassily at you to be like, no, we don't think we're just regular dudes, and we don't. And I think that it's really important to continue to hold ourselves to that. But when I think about what it means to be like better than normal or that next level, part of that to me is like being willing to move past the status quo and acknowledge when we don't want to just be that. So for me, I just want to say I'm really, really grateful for you because, you know, obviously the way that it came up puts you in a vulnerable situation, but also talking about it on this platform puts you in a vulnerable position again. And again, as a common theme in this podcast, you continue to be willing to put yourself in a vulnerable position in the interest of learning and growing and developing and being more than you were before. And I'm just so grateful that you're consistently willing and wanting to be more. And just, it means so much for the way that you show up and the way that you come to your friendships and your relationships and your family, just always wanting to do better and be more for them.
And I really appreciate that, because you're right to call out in the middle of a room, you know, a super lighthearted room where we're having, you know, we're playing beer pong, to be like, hey, I'm sorry and then later come to you again and say, I'm sorry. It takes a lot. And, arguably, I feel like I'm better equipped than most to do that because I've been apologizing all my life. But, I very much appreciate that. And in terms of my gratitude, I've expressed it. I will continue to express it. But thank you for being this very much this rock in my life of being not only an opportunity for me to grow through my own misactions, but to encourage me to grow through every aspect. And then as a little bit of a change of form, I want to say thank you to Kim for being so flipping defensive of you, right? And like to say, hey, I'm going to challenge this man who is double my weight, double my size, and be like, you fucked up, go apologize to my boyfriend. Like that's, we both know she's not a pushover, but like, good on her. And like, so I'll be grateful for her, and I'll be grateful for you for both being such amazing friends, calling me out of my crap and giving me an opportunity to grow. Cause I think that's really important, because if we don't push each other as friends, let's face it, your manager is not going to do it. Right. You need.
Hey, if any of my team are listening, don't listen to Carlo. I will continue to push. Push hard and push far.
I knew it. It's rare to have people in your life that will continue to push you in the way that you do, the way that Kim does. And I'm appreciative of that, because through my own shortcomings, those aren't always opportunities to grow, but a shortcoming with somebody to make you accountable, that is an opportunity to grow. And so I'll take that on the chin any day.
Very, very cool. Well, this has been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for us to connect, and hopefully it's been a great opportunity for you as a listener to do some reflection on your own connections, relationships, friendships, and things that you may have done or may have experienced, and ways to think about them in different ways. And so I hope that we've offered you this opportunity today. So as always, we would love you to connect with us, whether it be the Discord or any of our other social media platforms. You know how to find us at Millennials Community, and we look forward to having you reach out to us, but also we're excited for the next episode, and we hope you are too. So we hope that you have a fantastic rest of your day wherever you are, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks, everybody.
Sorry for making you listen. Bye.